Hi, welcome to my first video on my incarnation of Julian Illet's PWM5 charge controller. Sometime last year I watched a few videos of Julian's. Being quite interested in solar power myself, I thought I'd set about building one myself, and I actually subsequently started selling them as kits on eBay. Now I do a little tiny one, which I call the Pico, which is about the size of a postage stamp. It's all surface mount, but this particular video is on my latest version of Julian's board. Coincidentally, he recently did a video showcasing a new through-hole version of his PWM5, which is kind of going back to his original design of the completed units he used to sell. Now, I'd actually thought about doing a through-hole version because I had lots of people asking if I could make their surface mount versions up for them because they couldn't solder surface mount. Now, I'm quite proficient with surface mount, spent many years doing it, so of course to me it's completely natural, but obviously not everyone has got the same kind of surface mount skills. So basically I redesigned my surface mount PWM Pico into a through-hole version, which we have here. It's quite small, it's about 33mm square. It's all through-hole. It uses the exact same circuit diagram that Julian Illet originally used. It even uses his PIC 12F683 micro code, so that it works exactly the same way that Julian's design does. It's quite clever. It's very fast in response from solar panel power. I can power it up in a second, and we'll see it bring the battery up to about 3.7 volts. There's a slight inaccuracy in the target voltage. I don't believe this really matters with sealed lead acid batteries. Most of them for cycle use are designed to run up to about 14.6 volts anyway, whereas this seems to float voltage around 12.7, maybe nudging 12.8, but actually that is still within most sealed lead acid battery float voltage ranges anyway. So I'll just connect it up to the battery and we'll see it do its little boot up sequence, which is a slight delay, 200 milliseconds delay, 2 seconds of blue light, and then it'll start going through its voltage measurement and PWM sequence depending on the voltage of the battery. The battery I've got here is just a 12 volt 7 amp hour SLA. It's on its last legs, so it actually takes a charge quite rapidly. So I've got an 800 milliamp transform based power supply just feeding along the white wire. This is in the solar input side, this is the battery side, and because the battery takes a charge very readily, you'll see the voltage climb incredibly quickly on the voltmeter that I've got just here, just out of shot. Hang on, let me zoom out a little bit. There we go. And you'll just see the little LED come on, and it'll start blinking quite quick. Right, that's its boot up sequence, and now it'll start. It's started modulating straight away, because straight away we're up to around 13.7, 13.8. If I connect a small load to the battery to tug the voltage down a bit, the charge controller will go into voltage display mode. So I shall just go and rig that up. Right, just off camera I've rigged up a small 5 watt 12 volt bulb, and that is now pulling the battery voltage down to below the PWM voltage of the charge controller. Now at this point the charge controller will give a visual indication of the current battery voltage. It does this by a series of flashes. Now they start as 2 long flashes and then a series of shorter flashes. It's showing, actually this one is showing 13.1. It's 3 longer flashes and then 1 very quick flash. You'll notice now it's actually started, because the battery voltage is dropping slowly due to the bulb consuming the energy, and the incoming power isn't sufficient to supply the 5 watts. It's only 800 milliamps. Then what's happening is the battery voltage is dropping very slightly, and this has now dropped down to under 13 volt display. It's now showing 12.9 by the look of it. So 2 short flashes and then 9 faster flashes. It's designed so that at a glance you can get a quick visual representation. I don't quite know why. My power supply can't be 800 milliamps because a 5 watt bulb at 12 volts isn't 800 milliamps. It's about 350 or something. So there's something not quite right there, but I suspect that's my power supply more than anything. Now if I was to hook this up onto a more powerful solar panel that was able to exceed the load that the bulb is currently imposing, the charge controller would lift up its voltage back up to modulation voltage and would bleed a small amount of power back into the battery and then disconnect. But it does it really rapidly, 120 hertz. It's quite fast. So it uses a full pulse width modulation. If the battery voltage drops very slightly below the threshold, it holds the MOSFET on longer. If the battery voltage increases, it reduces the pulse length. And it works quite well. I haven't got a scope to hand to show it, but it does work very effectively. It does a very good job at holding the battery voltage at pretty much where it's supposed to be. Certainly well under the damaging voltages that a sealed lead acid wouldn't like. So I'll just yank this bulb back out again and we'll just watch the voltage come back up again. Right, it's going to rise slowly back up again as the battery gets charged. And like I say, this battery's had it, so it'll take a charge very quickly. Literally a few seconds and it'll be back up to float voltage again. 13.3 now. You'll notice the flashes have changed. 13, just creeping to 13.4. I can't imagine this unity meter's particularly accurate. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. So yes, it's about on par with this. What you sometimes find, I've got quite long leads to the battery and they're quite thin, so the voltage that under load, when you've got power from the solar panel, the voltage seen by the micro is slightly different to the voltage at the battery terminals. That's the downside with using thin cables. So these sort of things you need to use as thick a cable as you can possibly can. So the voltage is now approaching float voltage, and you will see this LED start flickering in a second as it comes back up there. There we go. So now the battery is reached full voltage, and you'll notice the flickering. It started off slow. That's because it's still keeping the MOSFET on for a period of time and then off and then on and off, cycling. But the higher the battery charge gets, the less time the MOSFET is on, so the brighter the LED becomes. It doesn't matter if it uses more energy whilst it's burning an LED because it's already at fully charged voltage. So it is holding it solid at 13.8 on this meter, 13.7, 13.8. Now I reckon these have about a 0.3 volt accuracy on the battery voltage, which as far as I'm concerned is absolutely fine. Like I say, sealed lead acid batteries are quite happy at 13.7, 13.8. If they're being used as a constant float voltage. If you're using the energy every day, you can boost the battery voltage a bit higher, and they're quite happy with that. It's only if you start running above 14.8 they start getting into problems. So that's it now, modulating, batteries charged, and this would just stay doing that all day forever. That's how it's designed to work, and it would just continue doing it. The other function that these PWM5 charge controllers can handle is bulk charging the battery after it's been discharged. So after the there hasn't been any input from the solar panel for a period of time, and the battery has started to deplete, what happens is when the power to the panel is available again, when the sun's come up, the charge controller enters a bulk charging phase, and what it does is it pushes the voltage of the battery up to about 14.6 for a period of time, just to make sure that it's fully saturated, and then after a given time it starts bringing the battery voltage back down again to 13, supposed to be 13.5. That's how the original code is written, but invariably, due to component inaccuracies, they quite often run at around 13.6, 13.7. I've got a couple that actually run at 13.8. It doesn't affect the batteries seem fine, but it's just a slight inaccuracy. Julian Illet is supposed to be doing an updated bit of software which will enable a slight tweak on this to counteract any inaccuracies, but he's not done the software update yet. They keep batteries fully charged. They consume very little power in themselves. Now, if you hook this up to a DVM so that it's being powered by the battery, take the solar off, you can actually measure how much current this is consuming from the battery when there is no solar energy available. This particular charge controller I ran last night, and it was showing 650 microamps at a constant output while the LED is off. When the LED comes on, it goes to about 1.8 milliamps just briefly, and then drops back down to 680 microamps again. So it just sits there. So over the course of an hour, say, it actually averages out to less than 1 milliamp, which is quite a low drain on any battery. I mean, it really is tiny. 1 milliamp would last for hours and hours and hours and hours of no sunlight, even on a 1.2 amp hour lead acid battery. So there's no chance that the charge controller will deplete the battery, even for extended periods when there's no sun. This is one of the main advantages on this particular device over some of those cheap Chinese ones. Now, I don't mind the cheap Chinese charge controllers. They have lots of features. You can have an output on them, and they can have the output switching, and they'll protect the output from short circuits and all that sort of stuff. But they continuously consume from the battery. So if you had a very remote location where you need solar energy to be put into an SLA, and then there's going to be nobody to look at the screen on or it's not doing anything other than charging the battery, you don't really want your super fandango LCD screen to be burning up battery power when there's no sunlight available, which is where these particular devices are really good. Like I say, they consume probably an average, it's less than 1 milliamp of an average on an average, which is minuscule. Whereas those, even the cheap sort of £6 or £7 Chinese imported charge controllers, whilst they're quite feature packed and they actually do a fairly good job, I don't believe they're PWM, but they certainly do regulate battery voltage fairly well. They consume about 80 or 90 milliamps from the battery. So over a course of a night time, or say 3 or 4 days when there's no sunlight to put any energy back into a battery, it basically is just depleting the battery, just keeping itself working, which is kind of wasteful. So that's where these little tiny PWM5s come into their own. Now, I do actually sell a surface mount version of this on eBay, and after this one has been tested, it needs a thorough shakedown yet. After it's been tested, I will be putting these on eBay as well. As you can see, they work quite effectively. I've spoken to Julian Illet about selling them. He's more than happy for me to sell them. I have been selling them since around September time in the what I call the Pico, which is a tiny little charge controller. I don't think I've got one here to show, not an open one. It's basically the size of a postage stamp. It's really tiny. And it's all surface mount, so you need to have fairly good surface mount skills, because it's using 0805 surface mount components, with the exception of the MOSFET, which is a standard TO22. It's the same device that's on this one, but it's using still a PIC 12F683, but surface mount version of it. Everything else is surface mount, so it is tiny. It's that big. It's really tiny. Still the same. They call them. Julian called it a PWM5. Actually, it'll handle much more current than 5 amps. Julian thinks 6 amps is a good limit. I've actually run them quite happily at 10. The MOSFET gets slightly warm at 10 because there's no heatsink or anything. The MOSFET is basically just sat doing its job. But at 10 amps, they're okay. I'm experimenting with double MOSFET versions to push the current handling capacity, especially because they're designed for 12 volts, and 12 volts, obviously, you get more current. The lower the voltage, the higher the current. So the device needs to be able to handle a fair amount. But these will be available on eBay soon. Anybody interested, then just buy one. But they are quite nice little units. They're effective, and they do a good job at keeping a sealed lead acid or a flooded battery, or even an AGM fully charged, with a solar panel up to around 100 watts. It'll need 100 watts of limit just to keep the MOSFET temperatures under control. Now you can double stack these, so you can. There's nothing to say you can't have 2 solar panels, 2 100-watt solar panels, each solar panel having its own charge controller, and both of those charge controllers charging a common battery. You can do that. You can have as many solar panels and charge controllers as you like into one battery. All that happens is when each charge controller sees the battery at its own float voltage, it'll just go into PWM. Even if there's a slight inaccuracy between them, all that happens is you'll end up with all but one charge controller running at PWM, and all the rest of them, the remaining one will just continue putting juice in. If you draw more current out, then the voltage will drop, and more PWMs will reduce to switch the current back in again. So yeah, you can put multiple on the battery. I've had 5 and 5 solar panels running into one battery, and it's absolutely fine. Works fine. It's a very effective way. It eliminates problems of shading as well, because you can have panels all pointing in different directions. So you can have one sort of pointing east, and then south, and then west. Have each one have their own charge controller, and all charging a common battery, so you can actually have power throughout the day. None of the panels pull the other voltage down, and all of them kind of add up to provide power constantly to the battery. So it works very well. And they're just a small little module, and they're really tiny. It's like I say, 34 by 33, tiny little board. So there you go. That is my version of Julian Illet's PWM5 charge controller.